Before we move forward and dive into looking at textures for this one, we're going to have to take a step back and we're going to talk a bit about rendering. In particular here, we're going to talk about the other type of rendering that we haven't been doing, which is going to be that CPU-based rendering, or in short, working with Arnold. So when it comes to our CPU-based renders, that's going to be our central processing unit, meaning it's going to be using our entire computer, not just our graphics card like Hardware 2.0. There's going to be a few industry standard renderers you'll run into. So one of the ones is Arnold, which is located inside of Maya. There's also RenderMan, which is used exclusively, or perhaps not exclusively, but used heavily by Disney. And then there's also going to be V-Ray. So these are the common players in the game. The nice thing is they all work very similarly, but they're all just a bit different. If you learn on one, you can quickly pick up the other ones. We'll be working with Arnold in this particular section. Those are the major renderers, though. Now, what's going to be one of the big differences here? We talked a bit about this CPU renderer. We're going to have longer render times, and I want to emphasize this. This may be a shock to some of you. It is going to be a lot longer, and depending on the power of your computer, it may be longer or shorter than mine. So just be aware, longer render times, that's going to be a big factor, but it's going to look better, okay? That is the trade-off. We're going to get something that looks prettier and something that starts to have a film quality production. So that is going to be one of the major things that we are going to be dealing with. Now, there's another factor about Arnold to be aware of, and most of the renderers nowadays, which is they are PBR based. PBR. This stands for physically based renderer. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's going to be taking into account lighting. It's going to be using lighting as its main factor. So we're going to need to incorporate lighting into our renders to make it work. In addition to this, the textures are going to be lighting centric, meaning that in order to understand how to create the textures for the object, you need to understand the physically based rendering. Now, physically based rendering kind of really hit the scene in 3D in about 2014, 2016. That's when it took off and we started to see it used heavily across the industry and across games as well. Prior to that, they were using the specular workflow, which is what we explored in the previous section with the ball. But PBR, as of recording this, is the industry standard that you will encounter in both games and film. So the techniques that we looked at previously, you could consider those antiquated, outdated, but they still are used every now and then. PBR is going to be the standard that you're going to use and what we're going to kind of use moving forward. So let's get started and explore the Arnold render view a little bit here and kind of discuss how this all comes together and how everything looks. So we'll use our character for this just to get started. The first thing we want to do is switch ourselves over into an Arnold rendering mode. What we'll do is we'll come up here to the render settings and just make sure we're set up for Arnold. If you've cleared out your preferences recently, it might already be set for you. Or if you're just firing things up with a new project, it may be saved as well. You'll see mine is currently set to the Arnold renderer. Yours may be set to Hardware 2.0. Remember, you can just swap it here from Hardware 2.0 to Arnold renderer, with Arnold being the default. With that set, we'll come into this menu more later on. For now, we'll close this out and we can open up the Arnold render view. Now, you can access the Arnold render view in one of two locations in Maya 2023. You can either use the Maya view here, which has been adapted to use the Arnold render view, or you can come up to the Arnold menu to access the Arnold render view. You'll see under Arnold, there's a render option at the top, or you can click this button to open the Arnold render view. They should be the same. In older versions, they are different. So if you are working in 2022 or older, just be aware that the Maya render view is distinctively different than the Arnold render view. They were consolidated in 2023. Now, how does this differ to begin with? Well, you might notice that the entire user interface is different, which is fun for those of us just learning. You'd expect it to be the same. How do we render? Well, this button here is how we render. If you go ahead and click that red play button, it will begin our render. And the thing about Arnold is it renders iteratively. Now, you might notice that it didn't really do anything. We just kind of see darkness here, right? Well, why is that? Remember, this is PBR, physically based rendering. we don't see anything because we don't have a light. So one of the big difference about rendering with PBR versus rendering with something like Hardware 2.0 is you absolutely need to have lights present to make it work. So let's drop in a directional light here. First, pause this, okay? Click this pause button here. Pause that, very important. And we can go ahead and create light and directional here. I can move this over here. And we can flip on our light switch. Remember, that's the light bulb here, or you can hit that lovely 7 key. This just gives us a preview of where the light's going. I'll change the angle so it's a little bit more interesting. And we can come back into our render view. And now if I click this render button, you will see it's going to render out our character. And this is the result we get. Now, you might notice it's a bit different than what we're seeing here in our main view. And that's because it is using more advanced mathematical algorithms to calculate the result here. One of the things you'll notice immediately is that the intensity is not quite where it needs to be. And that's because the light's calculated just a bit more accurately here. With something like a directional light from the sun, if I crank this up to maybe 10, you'll see that in our viewport, that gives us something really blown out. But inside of our render view, it's not as blown out as it could be. I think maybe bumping this to intensity of something like 3 might look kind of nice. All right, so that's going to give us access to that renderer. Now, let's just explore some features we have in here, or perhaps not features, but some things we get for free. Let me add something for the light to hit like ground here. Let's store a snapshot to compare, though. You'll notice it's a bit different here. So how do we store a snapshot to compare? We can come up here to View and Store Snapshot, and that will store a little snapshot along the bottom. I can then pause my renderer here. And I'm going to create a ground plane here by just coming to Polygon Primitives and Plane, scaling this up and moving this underneath the character. And then I'll just click the render button again here. And you'll see that we have a pretty drastic change to our scene, and it looks a lot different than what we're seeing in our viewport, right? So let's talk about what's going on here and why the CPU renders are so powerful. If I toggle between these, you can see the obvious difference is in this bounce light, this reflected light here. This little section here is part of a operation we like to call global illumination, or it may also be referred to as something like bounce light. This is going to be the lighting that occurs all around us and is a factor of light in the real world. So when we're dealing with light in the real world, let's say we hold a bright red ball or some sort of object close to a wall, what you will notice is that some of the color from the ball is going to bounce onto that wall. And it's most apparent with a saturated object near a white surface, but that is the property of light to bounce. So light as a particle bounces. It moves around through space, and that is what globally illuminates a scene. It fills in the lighting. Now, in our first project using Hardware 2.0, we had to fake this with an ambient light, but using a CPU-based renderer like Arnold, we get this for free. That's one of the huge perks to using CPU renderers and why it takes so long for them to render. But you can see that amazing difference there, the bounce light, the object interacting with the ground plane there. Now, another thing we're getting is better quality to the shadows. Notice the shadow quality is actually really good here. This looks a bit pixelated because it is a 540 image. It's not very big. If we switch this to 1080, it'd look a lot better. But you can see we're getting those nice crisp shadows in this instance. Now, something to be aware of is not all lights work with this either. I mentioned the ambient light. Let's come up here to View and Store Snapshot. You might be thinking, it'd be nice to just bump a little bit more light into here. Well, let's add in something like an ambient light. That should do the trick. And you'll notice that when I click the render button, nothing changed. These are identical between the first shot and the last shot. So when it comes to things like ambient light, this is straight up not compatible with Arnold. And there's actually several lights that aren't with Arnold. The ambient light is not, and if you come up here and use something like a volume lights are also not compatible with Arnold currently. This may change in the future. It's hard to say, but they're currently not operational. All right. So when it comes to lighting, we can use pretty much all of these except for the ambient light and the volume light. With that said, we lose lights, but we also gain them. You'll notice under Arnold, there is a light section, and we'll go ahead and explore those later on. Just be aware that some lights do work, some lights don't. So that ambient light is not, and that volume light is not. So since we're on the topic of lighting, let's go ahead and transition over to looking at Arnold lights next and see what Arnold gives us access to make our renders look even better.